this morning, and let me ask you a question. How many of you have been through the book of Zechariah before?
And where?
The book of Zechariah. How many of you have been through the book before? In a study basis.
Exactly.
There you go. If you've been in Bible Study Fellowship or any of these series that go through the Bible, you certainly have. But it is not a very familiar book. I can tell you that. In fact, if you just read through it without knowing anything about it, you would say, this is weird. But it's not a book that you could just read through. It's a book you have to study. And hopefully I've done my homework so I can explain some of these things that are going on in Zechariah, because they make perfect sense if you use the other books of the Bible, which tell us and interpret Zechariah for us. But standing alone, it is a very challenging book. Well, we're in chapter 6 this morning, and we're at the end of the visions that Zechariah had all in one night. This will be the last of those. And today, the title of this is God Judges the Nations. Now, we know that he has judged Israel in the past for 70 years in captivity. We know he's going to judge them in the future because we learned last week, because of the wickedness and the things that they learned in Babylon and carried back or around the world. And it was this thing called commercialism, if you remember, or the love of money. There's nothing wrong with money, and money can be used for a wonderful thing, but when you fall in love with it, remember Scrooge, Donald Duck? He would get in his big room and play with the money, threw it up, but he wouldn't give a dollar or a dime to anyone to help them. That's the kind of thing that Jesus spoke against when he said that money, the love of money, was the root of all evil. But God is going to judge the nations. By the way, that includes the United States of America, all the nations in the UN, and all the rest. Because we have sinned, and God has to judge sin. And let me just talk about a couple of things. And we're the greatest nation that's ever came upon the face of this earth, including all of those empires that were around for a long time. No one disputes that. However, I look back at some of the things that God has judged us with, and I'm just amazed. The first thing I think of is North Korea. Here's this tiny nation of 20 million people that has held us hostage for 50 years. 20 million people. And we don't know what to do about it. And we can't figure it out. Then I go back to Vietnam, where we spent, 20, 30 years fighting this war in Vietnam. What did we get from it? Oh, we spent a few $100 billion, but we walked away with nothing. And now we have this country who Miriam is from, called Afghanistan. And we have this problem of the longest war we've ever fought. I'm not sure what the war is all about, but we fought it for, 17, 20 years? And we still are not done. And you would think we could solve this problem, but God, I think, uses these things to show us that we're not that great, we're not that big, we're not that fierce. That one little nation, by the way, all of these different nations that have held us captive are all about 20 million people, as I look back at the populations. And by the way, no one has ever conquered Afghanistan in history, including Alexander the Great, who went over the mountains and in there and tried to do it. No one has ever done it. And so it should teach us a lesson that we probably won't. But yet, we're going to continue to try. But anyway, God judges the nations, including the United States of America. In chapter 5, we saw how God will judge Israel in the end times. Now, he again judged them back in that day for their idolatry by sending them into Babylon for some 70 years. But he will judge them in the future because they are a secular people today They do not worship God. There's a few Orthodox people, Jews there, but as a whole, they do not worship God. They worship money. And by the way, they're very good at making money, as we talked about last week. And we saw the vision of the flying scroll last week, which demonstrates the fact that he's going to judge them by their own law, the Ten Commandments. And he will use that to judge them. And we also saw the woman in the basket, which represented wickedness, the commercialism that they learn in Babylon, that they are taking throughout the world. But again, they had already been judged, but they're going to be judged again in the future. Now, Zechariah, like most of his prophets or counter prophets that lived in his day and even before them, he prophesied during the times he lived on things that were going to happen then. By the way, that was about 550 to 500 BC. And he wrote this book in about 518 to 520 BC. By the way, that's recorded in the book, so we know that. And after the return of the Jews from Babylon, this was during the time he prophesied. He would then go on to prophesy about the end times. And the rest of this book is going to have a lot of prophecies about the end times, either of judgment or he will prophesy about the millennium. One is good and one is bad. The millennium is that time when Israel would be the focal point of God's plan for the earth. Now, we're going into just a little bit of detail about this. There's a book that I'm reading right now called The Evangelicals. It's a brand new book, just came out in 2017. Big book. But it's written by Francis Fitzgerald. And the book is all about how the evangelicals shaped America. From the very beginning in the 1700s, to the 1800s, to the 1900s, all the way up to today. And it's all about Moody and Finney and Billy Sunday, Billy Graham, who influenced them, how they influenced politicians in America. It's a very fascinating book. But the book points out that prior to the early 1900s, most evangelists, most preachers, were either post or millennium in their philosophy of the end times. Now you say, what is that? Some of you probably know. Well, a post-millennialist, my father was a post-millennialist, by the way. He passed away several years ago. It teaches that the gospel will usher in the kingdom. That things will continue to get better and better as we take the gospel throughout the earth. And then all of a sudden the millennium will come. Well, then we got World War I, and that put a damper on that. Guess what happened 20 years later? We got World War II, and it wasn't bringing in the millennium. Things were just getting worse. So there's not a lot of post-millennialists around today. Now, amillennialists simply means that there is no millennium. You just go along until Christ returns to the earth, and then you go into heaven or the other place, and that's eternity is here. That's an amillennialist view. But interesting, today, in a recent survey, this is fairly recently, this past year, 65% of evangelicals and our fundamentalists today, preachers and all those, are premillennial. 13% are amillennial. 4% are postmillennials. They're all dying off, just like my dad did, because that view of the future is pretty much gone. Now let me expand on premillennialists. I think most of you know what that is. But it simply means that today, we, the church, are waiting for the rapture. When Jesus will call all of his own, that's the church, out of this world to meet him up in the air. And the dead in Christ will rise first, and we will rise up to meet him in the air. After that happens, there will be this period called the tribulation upon the earth. and it's divided into two parts, 3.5 years, 3.5 years, according to the book of Daniel. 3.5 years of false peace, and then 3.5 years where all hell breaks loose, and that's called the Great Tribulation period. And then after that period of time, there will be the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, and then all rebellion will be put down at the end of that, and then there will be new heavens and new earth, and there will be eternity. So that's the pre-millennialist view. And you say, why was that not popular then? Because there were pre-millennialists around. Why is it so popular today? Well, I believe the book of Daniel told us that, and I'll read you just one verse. If you remember the very end of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 4, the angel told Daniel, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end." Now, I think we're living in the end times right now. It says, until the time of the end, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Now, what does it mean, many shall run to and fro? It means things are going to speed up. It means we have things like airplanes and cars and things where we can get to different places very, very quick. And if Elon Musk has his way, they're going to build a tunnel from LA to New York, and we're going this tunnel and be there in an hour. It's called a triple speed train, I guess, or whatever it is. So things are speeding up, and knowledge is increasing. We know that because they're telling us now this thing called artificial intelligence that some of you have placed around the house, where you can say, Google, turn on my favorite song, or buy this for me, or do whatever, that they're going to be smarter than we are. Well, I personally think we're going to be out of here before that happens, but that's what they're predicting for the future. So, no question, we're living in the end times, just as Daniel talked about, and I believe he talked about that we are going to have more knowledge, and because that's the way it's going to lay out in the future. Now, a former pastor of a church, and he wasn't a very good one, by the way, I won't mention his name, but he couldn't preach. That was his number one problem. And, when you're a pastor and you can't preach, you got a problem. Anyway, he, and I had a little confrontation with him from time to time about how much he studied or didn't study and all this kind of stuff, and it wasn't my place, but I did anyway. Anyway, he says, I think I'll teach the book of Revelation. I said, teach the book of Revelation? Because I already knew what his view was. He gave me a book early on that Worthy is the Lamb, and it was a book that taught that Revelation was all in the past. It was done. It was over. All in history. And so I said to him, Dr. So-and-so, he was a doctor, by the way. I said, so what view are you going to teach the book of Revelation from? There's all these different ones. He said, premillennial. I said, why? He says, because it's the only one that makes sense. And I said, but you believe this, but this is the only one that makes sense? Anyway, that's another story. It just didn't make any sense at all to me. But the premillennial plan says that God has a plan for Israel, and God has a plan for the church and the Gentile nations, and both come together when there's new heavens and new earth, and we have eternity. You see that in Revelation 21:1 and Isaiah 65:17. Isaiah predicted it many years ago when he said there's going to be new heavens and new earth. Now, the purpose of the millennial, because people ask, why is the purpose of it? The 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth from Jerusalem, is to establish what God intended in the first place. That's what it is. A kingdom ruled by God the Son, with Israel as a kingdom of priests. That's what he intended in the very first place. And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, when the angel visited Mary and told her that she was going to have a son and it was going to be from the Most High, here's what he said in Luke 1, verse 31. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Highest, and of the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom there will be no end. In the New Testament, we are told that he is going to take the reign of his father David. Now, Jesus will demonstrate to all peoples, all monarchs, all kings of all times how it was supposed to be, the way that God intended it from the beginning for that 1,000 years. But Israel didn't hold up their end of the bargain, so he couldn't do it then. He had to delay it until the millennium. Now, you say, what role will we play during this 1,000-year reign of Christ? Well, the Bible tells us in Revelation 24, Daniel 7:22, and other places, we will rule and reign with Christ during that period of time. That's what he's told us that we're going to do. So there's a place for Israel, a place for the church, there's a place for all of God's people. Okay, enough of that background. By the way, there's only 15 verses in this chapter, so I had a little time to do a little bit of review. We come to the last and final vision of the 8 or 10, depending on who's counting, that Zechariah had all in one night. So we've taken several weeks to cover this time. All of these several weeks we've taken, he had all these visions in one night. I can imagine how he was. Now we come to the vision of the 4 chariots here in this chapter, but a quick review. This will be the last time we go through this list because we're entering the second part of Zechariah. Remember the first vision with the riders under the myrtle trees? These were riders under the myrtle trees that were patrolling the earth with these colored horses. And they were going out across the earth and they were reporting back to the rider on the red horse, which was none other than the pre-incarnate Christ, or Jesus. And when they reported back, they said that there was peace on the earth, except there was no peace in Jerusalem. God wasn't happy about that. He had called these nations to judge Israel, but they had went beyond what he wanted them to do. So he wasn't happy about that. So he's going to judge them, and he did, by the way, as we'll see right here. Now the second one was the vision of the 4 horns. You remember these 4 horns represented the 4 world empires. First one being Babylon, then there was Persia, and then there was Greece, and then there was Rome. And all of these were decapitated, so to speak, or crushed by the 4 carpenters or the 4 smiths that came after that. I combined these 2 into one vision. And I believe that the carpenter, as it represented, was none other than Jesus Christ, who was a carpenter, by the way, when he lived here on this earth. He took them all down. They were judged. The 4th was the man with a measuring line, and this was the man that was measuring Jerusalem. And anytime you see in the Bible anywhere God measuring something, it means he's going to focus on it. He's going to expand it. And they were going to expand Jerusalem. This was in the day they were rebuilding it, and it will be expanded greatly during the millennium. Then we saw the vision of Joshua and Satan. Joshua representing the high priest, representing Israel, and he had these dirty clothes on. And Satan is there accusing him, saying, look, this guy is dirty, he's filthy. Are you going to honor him? And God said, no, I'm going to clean him up. So he did. And we can't clean ourselves up. It's a good picture there. Only God can do that. And the next one was the branch and the stone with the 7 eyes. And we know, and we're going to see that again today, this was none other than the Lord Jesus Christ, who's called the branch and the stone. And the 7th is the lampstand of the 2 olive trees, representing the 2 witnesses in that day, which was Joshua, the high priest, and Zerubbabel, who was the governor over Judea in the line of David. And they also represented the 2 witnesses in Revelation chapter 11, which will be the 2 witnesses here on the earth during the last part of the Great Tribulation period. God always has himself a witness. and they can't be killed until God says it's okay. So the Antichrist goes crazy with these guys witnessing in the holy city for these 3.5 years. And then we had the flying scroll last week, and the woman in the basket, the flying scroll representing the 10 Commandments judging Israel, and the woman in the basket representing wickedness, which he's going to put down. And now we get to the 4 chariots, or the last. Again, these are not dreams. These are visions, meaning that he had his eyes wide open, just like John did in the book of Revelation, writing down all these things. So chapter 6, verse 1. Then I turned and raised my eyes and looked, and behold, 4 chariots were coming from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were mountains of bronze. Now, I don't know about you, I don't know of any mountains of bronze anywhere in the world. None. They were made of brass or bronze. What does bronze or brass represent in Scripture? Judgment. Absolutely. It was one of the metals in the tabernacle that was used to judge sin, one of the 2. One was the bronze laver, which was where they washed and cleaned themselves. The other was the brazen altar, where they offered the sacrifice. This was all for sin. And when John saw the glorified Christ in Revelation chapter 1, you remember, what did he see? He saw all these priestly robes and everything until we get down to his feet, and they were made of fine bronze or brass, representing the fact that Jesus is the judge of the earth. Now, the 2 mountains, most scholars agree, are Mount Zion and the Mount of Olives. So this would put the 4 chariots down into the Kidron Valley. Now, if you have been to Jerusalem, you can stand on the Mount of Olives and you can see Mount Zion also. And you look down there and you're in the Kidron Valley, and you look up and you see the walls of the temple. So you know exactly where that's at. Now, we can assure one thing, that assume that these chariots had horses and they had drivers. So let's just kind of put that in the equation. And these 4 chariots, they're colored, by the way, are similar to what John saw in the book of Revelation chapter 6. Remember the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? You know, you can mention the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse to someone that doesn't know the Bible, someone that's not a Christian, they know what you're talking about. Everybody knows the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You should say to them, aren't you afraid? Because they should be afraid if they know what these are, and yet they just kind of put them aside. But this was the beginning, these kicks off, of the Great Tribulation period, are the judgments in the earth. And the first horse we know is a white horse, and later on this white horse is going to represent the Lord Jesus Christ coming back to the earth. But in the beginning here, this white horse, because white represents victory, this is, we believe, the Antichrist, because he brings in a false peace to the earth. That's part of his victory. But then, after the false peace comes in, all hell breaks loose. When he goes into the temple in the middle of the tribulation period, and he slays a pig and offers it on the altar, and then he sets up an image of himself to be worshipped. So this white horse didn't represent Jesus. That's later on. The second is a red horse, which we know represents war. It tells us there. The third horse was black, which represented famine, and the pale horse, the 4th, represented death. Now, Revelation chapter 6 is a summary of the whole tribulation period. Read that one chapter, and it gives you a summary of all these seals and the details that's going to happen later on. So let's get on to verse 2 and 3. I gotta get out of 1. With the first chariot were red horses, with the second chariot black horses, with the third chariot white horses, and with the 4th chariot dappled horses, which were strong steeds. We'll come back to that in a minute because there's meaning to that. There's a slight difference from the colors in Revelation and here, but it's only slight. There's three of them that are the same, the red and the black. Horses are certainly the same in the white. But here it is called a dappled horse. And what is a dappled horse? Is that what it says in your version?
Yeah, it's gray.
Yeah, dappled horse. They're silver and gray. I got the horses wrong last time I mentioned this, and somebody told me that, so I want to make sure I got it right. So I looked it up. So some have said the horse here represents the pale horse, this dappled gray horse, in Revelation. I think there's a slight difference in that because I don't think it was insignificant or a minor thing that they're different. I'm not sure what those differences are, but I believe there is a difference. And we'll see some of that as we see what these mean. Verses 4 and 5. Then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, "What are these, my Lord?" And the angel answered and said to me, "These are 4 spirits of heaven who go out from their station before the Lord of all the earth." Now let's look at Revelation, back to Revelation chapter 7, verse 1. And here's what we read there. "After these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth or the sea or on any tree." This is until God tells them it's okay to do that. So I believe those 4 spirits in Revelation are the 4 spirits that we have here. I believe they are the 4 archangels before the throne of God that are powerful, powerful angels that he uses both in this chapter and Revelation to judge the earth. 4 spirits, 4 angels given power to judge the earth. And he's telling the Jews, God will judge the nations as well as he's going to judge Israel. So don't think you're being picked on. God must judge sin. Verse 6, it says, "The one with the black horse is going to the north country, the white are going after them, and the dapple are going toward the south." Verse 7, "Then the strong steeds went out, eager to go, that they might walk to and fro throughout the earth. And he said, Go walk to and fro throughout the earth. So they walked to and fro throughout the earth." This is not the same as patrolling the earth to see what's going on as in the beginning in Zechariah chapter 1. They are going out to actually judge the earth. So there's a difference here in what they're about to do. Now, notice they went north and they went south, but they didn't go east and go west. You know why? Well, if you go west, you go into the Mediterranean Sea from Israel. If you go east, you go into the Arabian Desert. So they went north and they went south. Makes sense. Now, both the black and white horses go into the north country. Now, in that day, the north country was Babylon because they came and invaded from the north, even though they were kind of northeast of Jerusalem. But I do not believe that will be true in the last days. In the future or last days, this represents Russia and its allies coming down to invade Israel. We see that they're named Gog and Magog, which is names out of Russia. We can go back to the table of nations in Genesis 12 and see that. This is outlined in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, this invasion from Russia from the north. And also in Revelation chapter 20, verse 8, the 2 names again are mentioned exactly, Gog and Magog. So how did all this end, this invasion of Israel? Well, it tells us that fire came down from heaven and devoured them. It wasn't the U.S. that defeated them. It wasn't the UN. It was God who defeated them. He will save Israel, not us. I want to look at verse 7 again because there's something interesting there. "Then the strong steeds went out eager to go." You can imagine a horse and it's just chomping at the bit and he's jumping up in the air. God has given him a command and he's ready to go. He's chomping at the bit. As I thought about this verse, again, I thought about directing it up to us. When God calls you and I to do something, are we chomping at the bit? Are we saying, oh God, you don't really want me to do that? You don't want me to talk to my neighbor. You don't want me to talk to my family. You know what kind of ruckus that charges up. We're not chomping at the bit. We're scared to death. That is the number one reason, by the way, that we don't do what God calls us to do, and that is to share our faith, is fear. Fear of an uprising, fear of this or fear of that. And now, that's a real fear, but we should be chomping at the bit to do what God called us to do. And you know, there's only really one thing He's called us to do, even though He spent 3 years teaching us how to live and all. But when He left, remember when He ascended into heaven? There's one thing He told His disciples to do, to witness. You will be my witnesses. That's the one thing He's told us to do. Now, there's a lot of different ways to witness. You can witness by your life, which is the most important thing, because what you do is more important than what you say. And people look at you and they know that you are Christian by your love and by what you do. And also it's important what you say. But we are called to do one thing, and that's to be His witnesses. How are we doing with that? I want to ask that question. Verse 8, and He called to me and spoke to me, saying, see, those who are inward go toward the north country have given rest to my spirit in the north country. When you do what God calls you to do, you will have rest in your souls. If you don't do what He calls you to do, you will have discourse in your soul. Your soul will be restless. There's a wonderful verse in Proverbs 16:7. It says, when you are in the will of God, He will make even your enemies to be at rest. You can have rest and peace when you do what God asks you to do. Again, I'm going to refer back to the evangelicals. There were some men and women that I was so impressed with that I had to go study more about their lives. And if there was one I could sing aloud above all others, it was Dwight L. Moody. This man, it was said of him, he emptied hell of more men and women than any other person that ever lived. He went through Europe. He went through the United States, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, and thousands and thousands and thousands came to know Jesus Christ. He mentored people like John Farlow, Ira Sankey, R.A. Torrey, who established Biola, by the way, because the Bible Institute of Chicago, all these other men went out and established them around the earth. Charles Finney, and he only finished the 5th grade in school. 5th grade, as far as he went. Now, he read a lot, he studied a lot, and he was totally yielded to God. What God can do with a person like that is just amazing. By the way, he was a shoe salesman. When a Sunday school teacher came in and told him about the Lord. What a man. There's so many great ones in there. Going on with verse 9 and 10, it says, then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, receive the gift from the captives from Eldiah, Tobijah, Jedaiah, who came from Babylon, and go to the same day and enter the house of Josiah the son of Zephaniah. You read that and you say, what is this? Well, these were Jews, wealthy Jews, by the way, who did not return to Jerusalem when the captives were set free or released. There were two groups of captives that went back to Jerusalem in two different phases. There was only about 50,000 that came back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls and rebuild the temple, which is only about 10% of what went out. What did the rest of them do? They stayed. They were making money. They were having a family. They were having a good time. Well, these 4 men, they were willing to share some of their wealth to help those who had gone back. So they sent a lot of money. Let's look at verse 11. Take the silver and the gold, make an elaborate crown, and set it on the head of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Now this was very strange because it's a coronation, crowning, and the Lord, through Zechariah, says, put it on Joshua, the high priest. Put it on his head. Now what was wrong with that? God had separated those 2 offices of king and priest. Never shall the twain meet. No one could hold both offices except for the Lord Jesus Christ. No man that ever lived. In fact, there was one, Uzziah, who tried, and a plague came upon him when he tried it. So here, this is very, very strange to put it on Joshua's head, the high priest, not Zerubbabel, who was the governor of Judea and in this line of David. God had already separated these. Now, the reason the crown did not go to Zerubbabel was God was not going to restore the throne to David's line until Jesus the Messiah came and established his throne during the millennium. No one after that period, after they went into captivity, was to be crowned the king until the king, Lord Jesus, came. By the way, it's been about 2,500 years since then. We haven't any kings in the line of David that have been on the throne. They're still waiting in the future for that time of the millennium. By the way, this was a ceremonial crowning, pointing to the time when Jesus would come as both king and priest. It wasn't real, it was a ceremonial. We're going to see in just a second. And Jesus, we know, is the only one who ever occupied all 3 offices of prophet, priest, and king. When he came as a prophet. When he went back to heaven, today he is our high priest, interceding for us. And when he comes again, he will come as what? The king. So he's the only one that held all 3 offices. Now, tradition has it that this crown was stored in the top window of the temple, waiting for the Messiah to come someday. And as you know, the Jews are still waiting for Messiah to come, even though he's already come. Because they didn't see this age that we're living in, called the church age. They went right from, they knew about the tribulation period because that was recorded. They went right from that to all the way to the millennium. They just skipped over us altogether. And we've been around now for 2,000 years. You know, I think someday we're going to find both the ark and this crown. I don't know where they are. Some believe the ark's in heaven. The crown might be too. But we know one thing, that the Jews protected this crown for the coming of the Messiah by storing it in the top window of the temple. Where it ended up after that, I don't know. But I think one day we're going to find both of those. Well, that'll be a happy day. Verse 12 and 13. Got to finish this up. This is your key verse today. Then speak to him, saying, thus says the Lord of hosts, behold the man whose name is the branch. From his place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Read the references that I have on this verse today, particularly in Isaiah chapter 11, which talks about the branch in detail, which is none other than the Lord Jesus Christ. Yes, he shall build the temple of the Lord, he shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule on his throne, and he shall be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. These 2 verses explain what was happening before this. Jesus is known as the branch. He's also known as the stone. By the way, there's over 100 names for God in the Bible. I have a list of those at home. I usually keep it in my Bible. Over 100 names. It's kind of interesting to go through those names, and you can pray over each one of these names because they're all names for God, 100 of them in the Bible. Now here it says twice, he, the branch, shall build the temple of the Lord. Now what does that mean? And which temple? Did you know there's 6? The ones that have been, and there's still ones to come. Let me tell you who they are. The wilderness tabernacle we know about. That's came and gone. There's Solomon's temple. There is Zerubbabel's temple, which we're talking about here in the book of Zechariah. There was Herod's temple, which was there during the time Jesus walked on the earth. There's the Great Tribulation temple. By the way, there has to be a temple because the Antichrist during that time of the tribulation goes into the temple, makes a sacrifice, and then makes an idol of himself or an image of himself to be worshipped. There has to be a tribulation temple. By the way, the Jews have already gathered, I'm told, all of the pieces for the temple to be built so it can go up real quick because they already have it underground. And then the millennial temple, which we see in Ezekiel chapter 40 through 48. This is the one referenced here that Jesus will build, and he calls it one house. All of these, he calls one house. And he says, my house shall be a house of prayer. Verse 14. Now the elaborate crown, a very elaborate crown, shall be for a memorial in the temple of the Lord for Elam, Tobijah, Jediah, and Hen, the son of Zephaniah. Hen, where did that come from? By the way, Hen is a Hebrew word that means favor, mercy, or kindness. So if you want to remember one Hebrew word, it's Hen. God's favor, his kindness, and his graciousness. Interesting word. Verse 15, we finish up. Even those from afar, that's the Gentile nations, shall come and build the temple of the Lord. In other words, they're going to bring also, just as in David's day, people from afar brought things, the timber and all these things to build the temple. Then you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you, and this shall come to pass if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God. Now, verse 15 says, if you diligently obey. God's promises do not depend on our faithfulness. We see that in 2 Timothy 2, 12 and 13. But our participation in God's promises do depend upon our obedience, because only God is faithful. Well, this is the end of the visions, but the prophecies of Zechariah will continue. There is an interlude, which we will cover next week in chapters 7 and 8, that will talk about what is worship and what is religion. That's an interesting topic. He addresses it way back there in the time of Zechariah. So remember, when you pray, thy kingdom come, you're praying for the Lord's return to this earth. God bless you all. Hopefully we'll see you next week.